Hey, man.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I got you nice and clear, man.
I got my mic here.
Cool.
I got a cat. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Very nice, man.
Old school zooming.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, we are back here for another episode of the NJAJE Shop Talk Jazz podcast thing, whatever. And I am here. I have the pleasure of interviewing the New Jersey All-State Jazz Ensemble Director for 2024, a buddy of mine, great tenor player, great writer, great big band leader, Andrew New. So, Andrew, how are you today, my friend?
Doing great, especially after that intro. You made my day.
Not bad, man. That's awesome. And I see you got some company there too, right?
Say hello to Pablo,
Paz Pablo. All right.
my writing friend.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, we just want to use the time to get to learn, a little bit more about you, maybe your upbringing, when you were a young student studying, and maybe your path throughout life and how you kind of gotten to where you're at. So I guess the first question I'll throw your way is, when did you get your start in music, and was it on saxophone?
That's a really good question. And no, it wasn't on saxophone. I grew up in a musical family. You might know my older brother, Peter New, is a trumpet player. He's 7 years older than me. So he was out like up, he was a grown up out there doing gigs when I was still essentially a little kid. So I kind of saw him paving the way for me. But I started on clarinet. I wanted to play trumpet, but my parents said I needed to play something different. And apparently, saxophone at the time was not an option.
Oh,
Neither was
wow.
apparently, I'm told. So I started on clarinet, which in the end was actually a really good foundation for learning all the woodwinds, but certainly saxophone. The transition was very easy and unusual for my upbringing, considering what I do now, is that my parents, for the most part, only played and classical music in the house. So for
Wow.
my first like probably 9 years until, as I said, my older brother Pete, was driving and had his own stereo and would have like be able to set the radio stations. I really only heard classical music, which is and then all of a sudden little things started to sneak in, and it was I would hear Cannonball Adderley, and then I would hear Maynard Ferguson or Chuck Mangione, and then Stan Kenton and Buddy, and then Charlie Parker, and then of course Grover Washington Jr. and the Brecker brothers. So all these things, like I kind of got a late start when it came to it, to my upbringing, but at the same time having that classical foundation, both as in terms of my ears and as my approach to my instrument, it gave me a little bit of a discipline to learning my craft that allowed me to adapt my playing to any style of music. And I did start playing saxophone between like seventh and eighth grade because I wanted to play in the jazz band. And my first saxophone that they gave me was a tenor. So I really started on tenor, gravitated back to alto when I went to college, and was actually a classical saxophone major at Temple. So I studied with Marshall Taylor and started studying with Larry McKenna because he was available and he was amazing. Sort of on the side, and then eventually sort of switched over. Since I was a 5 year program for performance and education, I did my 4 years with Marshall, and then my last year I studied full time with Larry. So I really feel like I got the best of both worlds. And when I play with really people that are classical musicians, if I'm sitting in an orchestra playing saxophone next to a Juilliard or conservatory trained woodwind player or brass player, I feel like I know how to speak their language a little bit more and match them. And brass players phrase things differently from the way saxophone players would naturally do it, and it really has helped me, not only to play with them but also to write for them as well.
Yeah, dig it. A lot of questions from all of that, which was great, by the way. You said your parents only played classical music. Were your parents themselves players at all? Did they play?
My Not professionally. And my father, more than my mom, is an amateur musician. He was a metallurgist, metallurgical engineer by trade. He's retired now, but played viola and trombone, both in bands and orchestras. There we go.
Yeah, that's right. King of the
And
orchestra.
it's a certain temperament that I think suits, especially for violists. It's there's a personality that think that tracks with that, and my father very much embodies that.
What an eloquent way to say it. I love it.
He's about to show you his best side, I think here.
Oh,
So
yeah, right. All good. We're prepared for that. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you too, you were talking about playing in ensembles at schools. So some of our students, that are going to be listening to this, I would imagine the bulk of them are in high school. What was your high school music experience like? Were the bands strong? Was it a week program? What was your experience like during those formative years?
Um, you know, that's the wonderful thing about Allstate is that it gives us opportunities outside of our own school program. Now, I am a proud product of a public school music education program. I graduated from Hatboro Horsham School District and went there my whole life, and it was an adequate music department. Um, I don't think it was remarkable. We had a jazz band. We did not have an orchestra, but I had some other opportunities outside of school to play with orchestras. But I'm very much of an advocate that regardless of your program, if it's a really good program, you should take advantage of it and embrace it. If it's not so good a program, you should also make sure that you are there supporting the other people who are there. Especially with these advanced students who are doing the auditions, they're doing the all-state bands and the camps and PYO, Kimmel Center, the Clef Club. We have so many opportunities outside of school, but I think you still need to remain loyal to your school program.
That's a great point. With, I guess, heading off into college, at what point maybe did you make the decision, music ed, performance, like, whatever your degree was, education, I think you said, right? But
it was a performance degree with an education certificate, I believe it was.
Okay. So at what point do you feel like in your chronology did you decide this is what I want to do? This is, why I want to, or this is the field that I want to get into?
Sometimes the decision is sort of made for you. Looking at my big brother again, Peter, who went into music, and we have another sister who's in between us who also went into music. She went to Bucknell University. My brother went to University of the Arts. I went to Temple. I was sort of like, you're 17 years old. You're trying to make decisions that are going to impact you for the rest of your life. And I was going to be my own person, and I'm going to be an engineer like my dad. Only to realize that after I had applied to school for engineering, all I wanted to do was play music and write music and practice and perform. And it was something that was sort of became as a revelation to me. And I'm not sure everyone has this revelation, but it was just like my mind was telling me, oh, this is the practical thing to do, be your own person, follow in your father's footsteps. But at the same time, I realized that my path was reaching out to me. I mean, to be, try not to be overly poetic about it, but sometimes the decisions are made for you. And I feel like as music educators, our role is not so much to try and, cultivate that next generation of performers because they're going to find their way to the stage one way or another. Our job is to find people that are going to sit in that audience and say, hey, when I was in school, I did that. I know how hard it is to prepare a concert, to learn an instrument, which is very unwieldy or difficult. I mean, I have great respect for the people that play instruments that are hard because saxophone is not hard. The learning curve is pretty shallow in saxophone. But that's why I think there's a lot of really incredible jazz saxophone players out there that may be not great saxophone players.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I feel flute players, piano players, brass players, bassoon players, double reed players. My wife is a double reed player. I have great respect because there is so much work that involves with just flatlining your level of playing, just staying at the level that you're already at, let alone advancing beyond that. Whereas saxophone, you could really I don't want to say phone it in because that's not really fair, but I think the people like a Michael Brecker who had gifts beyond all of us also had a work ethic that was beyond all of us. And he took the combination of all of those elements and which put him onto another plane.
Along those lines too, for myself, I primarily played bass my whole life. And it wasn't until recently where I started to get a lot more tenor action. So, I went over to tenor. I never knew what it was like to be a doubler. I just kind of focused in on one instrument. And now that I have to divide what time I have in my life to, a couple of instruments now, it's just amazing where you only have so much time in the day with all the other commitments that we have. Like you said, it's really kind of a grind mentally to know that you're just trying to stay at a level, let alone advancing. Like it's just, there's not enough hours in the day. So, dealing with that, I can imagine as a woodwind player, when you're doubling on flute, clarinet, everything, like time is needed on all those instruments. So at least for me anyway, that's definitely one of the things, I think about quite a lot. I mean, kind of like what you're saying to echo that. So.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, you would think, oh, bass trombone to tenor trombone. They're both trombones. It's got a slide. I struggle with making sure that I'm a good alto player as well as a soprano player as well as a tenor player. I do play bari sax, but typically it doesn't leave my studio here because it's really heavy. I hate to be that person, but we all make our choices, and I choose not to carry a whole lot of heavy instruments.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of work to play that instrument, and it's a lot of work to maintain all four of those same instruments. The saxophones themselves, you need to spend time on all of them, let alone when you have to be prepared to be sitting in an orchestra or sitting next to someone playing flute next to someone who only plays flute.
Yeah, that's great. Why don't we talk about the college years very quick at Temple? What was your music education like going through that program at the time, the teachers that you had, and maybe some insight about what music school is like for students who are listening to this that might be considering that path about going into music, whether ed or performance or wherever?
I think Temple, especially to now, is super exceptional in terms of its big band program. Right now, they have at least five big bands right now, which I mean, I don't know. You tell me, Earl. I mean, are there any other colleges outside of North Texas that has that number of big bands?
That's a big number, man. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. I mean, I have students and friends that are at NYU and Juilliard and Manhattan School, and there are not that many big bands there. University of the Arts did not have that. So I think that's an incredible place. At the time when I went there, um, as a classical saxophone major, I felt disconnected from the jazz majors because I was in more of the classical history and theory classes. I felt disconnected from the classical musicians because I'm playing a saxophone.
Wow.
Often I got grouped in with some of the straight education majors, but I was more of a performance minded person. So for a lot of my years at Temple, I certainly felt, like a man without a country. But
Mm.
at the time at Temple, the opportunities were there if you chose to take advantage of them. If not, and I think a lot of colleges are like this, that you can't help but be swept up in an incredible learning environment where everyone is super excited about it. But there's other places that, like, if you choose to kind of slide through, you can play music and you can play with other musicians, and sometimes you'll find some kindred souls and spirits, and your people that are birds of a feather, because they do gravitate towards each other. But if you feel like you just want to do your own thing, you can do that too. I mean, that's why I think it's really important to find that chemistry, both with the school itself, the people who go there, and then of course your private teachers who are going to be your mentors at the time. I teach at Swarthmore College, and my students there, it's not a performance oriented school, but they play really well. They have access to incredible private teachers, Philly orchestra members. Really, here in Philadelphia, there are incredible resources, and a lot of them teach at Swarthmore because it's a really nice place to teach. The students are brilliant, not just smart, but outliers. They think differently. These are the ones that will invent, Google or something like that.
Mhm.
Like landers on other planets and stuff like that. Whereas other schools, Ivy League schools, are exceptional, brilliant students, but there might be a similarness to them. Place like Swarthmore is good for a certain type of student who wants that place where they can really revel in their uniqueness, and that's what certain schools will do. Certain schools, like, all the sax players sound amazing, but they all sound the same. You want to, maybe, if that's a good fit for you, because I like how those guys sound, or if you want to go to a place where, no, I want to find my voice, there's probably a better place for you.
Yeah, that's interesting. And this is where you're kind of getting to the territory where I've met you and how I know of you more through the education thing. I mean, obviously the playing career is there, but I first met you when we were talking. I mean, even go back to Lower Marion, like, and you have your foot in not only just in college, but also in high school as well, like at different ages. Um, I guess before, and forgive my ignorance here, but when did you actually start your teaching? Was that right out of college, or was there a little bit of time where you were doing something else aside from teaching?
I was never teaching full time, and that was sort of by choice. I really wanted to make sure I'm not a morning person, so I really didn't want to get up every morning. Um, I was so focused on the performance end of things that I really want to make sure I was available. And I did some long-term tours. I did some cruise ships, and then. But yeah, I mean, I was teaching in college private lessons, but I don't do that nearly as much now because I love the teaching I do now is for the most part standing in front of an ensemble, a band. I
Yeah.
love because I really feel like we're creating something special in those moments. And you and me talking about kindred spirits, about big band jazz. A lot of people don't understand what that is. Is when they think big band, is it we're talking Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman and In the Mood, or are we talking about like Frank Sinatra and Michael Bublé and Harry Connick and that kind of stuff? No, I mean for you and me, and I think for so many of the people that I work with, I'm talking about teenagers and high school and college students that are playing this big band jazz that we do, 7-minute compositions, long improvisations, development sections. They're not only playing this music and understanding it, but doing it at an extremely high level. And for me, as a writer and as a published writer, because my music is published with Kendor, it keeps my foot connect or my ears and my sensibility in terms of writing connected to the people that might potentially be playing this music. So I like playing good music, but I think there are certain elements that are universal to music that's really hard and music that is just a little bit challenging. And I think you don't need to sacrifice quality to make it playable.
Yeah, that's great. And then how about we talk for a second about how composition came into your life, right? You talked a lot about playing clarinet, playing saxophone. When did composition become an area of interest for you?
Um, Composition and arranging, orchestration, they're all sort of separate elements that are all certainly connected. I was always really intrigued with scores, looking at scores. Like I go up to, in school, the director's podium, and they'd have all the scores laid out. And for some reason, it was just something that was fascinating to me, looking at how these parts were put together on all the different instruments. And I remember looking at like a sax soli and realizing that like the first alto and the notes in the first tenor almost looked like the same notes, but it was because of the transposition. They're playing in the same range, but it's a fourth lower. So I mean, it was just these little moments of like, oh, and I see, okay, when this part is sustaining, this other part is moving. When this part is harmonized, this part is unison. So those little elements were fascinating to me. But so I wrote my first big band chart and we performed it when I was in high school. My high school jazz band played. I did an arrangement of a Grover Washington tune because that was the music that I knew. And then I was writing, some jazz stuff. I studied with Larry McKenna for writing and arranging, and he had charts played on the Tonight Show.
Yeah, forget about it.
And I actually wrote for the marching band at Temple, and I used to play trumpet in the marching band.
Oh, wow.
Which was really, I always wanted to play trumpet, and I learned it
right.
in high school. And I played it all, I got a scholarship, so I played all 4 years in the marching band on trumpet. And I could play high notes and stuff, and I didn't have to worry about saving my chops for some like orchestra rehearsal later that night.
Right.
I'm a sax player, but it helped me with learning how to write the instrument. So, but I actually they hired me to write not big band, marching band charts. So I wrote, I don't know, a couple dozen charts for the marching band at Temple, which is at the time we were playing at Vet Stadium. Remember the old Vet?
Wow.
Compositionally, at this point I was still writing arrangements of things, and I struggled to compose a few tunes, and they just were bad. I just wasn't hearing. And then all of a sudden, I wrote like kind of a takedown from like on an Autumn Leaves. I wrote a bossa nova called Autumnal Equinox. Not exactly the same chord progression, but it was enough to give me the beginnings of how to start a new piece. And all of a sudden, probably in like my mid-20s, I just started composing music, like tunes. And that was something Dennis de Blasio told me. I remember showing him some arrangements when I took a couple of lessons with him, and like I started writing the arrangement before I finished writing the tune, which, it didn't occur to me at the time. It's like, okay, well, what's the tune, man? What's the tune? What's the A section? What's the bridge? I'm like, oh, I haven't gotten to the bridge yet, but I was arranging this first part. So I started writing tunes and then started arranging from the composition.
Yeah. Wow. That's crazy how similar our paths are, especially with Denny. That's amazing. I can remember doing the exact same thing. You're writing vertically and not horizontally, at least for me anyway, I was writing that way.
And not writing in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It's like you write this great part here, and all of a sudden you try and cram it together with something you wrote 2 weeks ago, only to realize that, wait a minute, this part doesn't connect to that. So whenever I compose something, I always try to hear what's coming to, approaching it, and then what follows it.
Awesome. Well, why don't we use that as a segue to get into your wonderful big band right now, the music that you're writing for that, and again, kindred spirits here. We both lead big bands. Why don't you talk about what it's like to actually lead a big band? You know, what goes into the production of getting something together, getting 18 to 20 bodies at the same spot.
I'm gonna say something that very few big band leaders say. It's awesome. It's amazing. So many big band people who lead big. Oh, it's so hard to keep that many people together. It's so expensive. It's such a hassle. People are paying. You know what? I love it. I love it for so many reasons. Because number one, it's just, and I think a lot of our introduction to playing jazz was sitting in our school jazz band. So I think for a lot of us, this takes us back to when we learned this art form. And a lot of people, my brother has often said this, that, all the big bands that we played in over the years, it was like, oh, it was just such a great hang, and to be able to sit as a trumpet player with three or four, because I use five trumpets, other trumpet players and talking, nerding out on mouthpieces and mutes and
Yeah,
whatever.
right.
Tony DeSantis has all his Yamaha trumpets and saxophone. I mean, drummers don't get to hang with other drummers. Bass players don't get to hang with other bass players. Saxophone players, we go on a big band and we're hanging with four other saxophone players. And I'm so lucky to have four incredible saxophone players that they just amaze me. And I can just sit back and let Chris Oates go off and bebop, his way through, a hard bop. What is this thing called? Love. Andrew Urbina, Skip Spratt, Dan Muller. I mean, these are all people that I looked up to over all of my years. And the fact that I'm sitting next to them, it's both humbling to me that they choose to do that. But at the same time, putting a big band together, it's really about number one, finding musicians that, they want to be there. And are they good enough? Do they get along with each other? Because I've had a lot of great musicians over the years come through my band, as all of us have, that have a big band, because you got to fill chairs. And sometimes great musicians don't necessarily connect with other great musicians. And that's that intangible, chemistry that, we're always seeking. And I've really gotten a fairly consistent pool of musicians that, even the handful of people that are subbing in are all kind of like, yeah, this is a good hang. And the
Yeah.
music is good. We're looking around thinking, so often, as good players, you might be the best player on the gig. Not to brag about, any of us, because, we're all just trying to do our thing and
Yeah,
try to
right.
play we can. But when you look down the line and you see that everyone else on your instrument and everyone else in every chair is the best and on the top of their game and the best in the business, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I need to step up my game. So I think it pushes us all to play better. And when you get along, both on stage and off stage, I mean, you're creating those moments that you look back at 10 years later, 20 years later, a lifetime later, thinking like, yeah, that was a really great moment.
Yep, that's absolutely wonderful. And again, being a big band leader yourself, when you get into the classroom, whether it's at college, whether it's in high school, having that experience of knowing what it takes to have a fun hang on a big band, it makes you such a more impactful teacher because you see it on the professional side of things too. What I'll ask you now is not everybody who's teaching jazz in a public high school or, whatever level, they might not be a big band soul, that might not be their area. So if you could give one piece of advice to maybe somebody who isn't as native to jazz, as native to big band as you and I are, what piece of advice would you give to a director that's maybe, considers themselves either a novice or, maybe like almost intermediate level?
Okay, that's a really, really excellent question, because there's a lot of really great musicians out there that had this ensemble thrust upon them.
Right,
Um,
exactly.
I'll give my a good example is my wife, who is an incredible musician. As I said, she's a double reed player. She went to Temple. She's a few years younger than me, and got her performance degree and grad degree in oboe and English horn performance. Now she teaches at a Philly public school, Masterman, which is a great school, and she conducts the jazz band at both the middle school level and the high school level, because it's 5 through 12 there. She's an oboe player, but she's a great musician, and what she did, fortunately, has a resource in me that can ask questions about, okay, I've got a really good drummer, bass player, trombone player, what can I do to feature them but not leave the rest of the band behind? I think a lot of people, especially with big band, they're sort of, for better or for worse, like if they had any big band experience, it might have been in high school, and that's sort of like imprinted on them. And sometimes those experiences may or may not have been good, but they also could also be somewhat out of date, or it was what it was at the time. And I think one of the things that I find frustrating when I see really, I see bands out there at jazz festivals, and they're sabotaged by not just a conductor that may not be experienced, but bad repertoire. I really take a lot of time to choose the repertoire for that's right, not just for the strengths in your band, but also maybe the weaknesses in your band too. There's nothing more, I would think, frustrating for that person that's struggling a little bit to get stuff that's just over their head, because there's a lead trumpet player that can play high G's, and you got guys that are playing jazz, and people that can do all this stuff, and sometimes they're just like a deer in headlights. And I think really thinking about every chair in your band, because it is a chamber ensemble. When that third trombone part is not being played, when that second tenor part is not being played, there's a hole in the section, and we hear it. So
Awesome.
I didn't exactly answer your question, but the one thing I would say is ask someone who knows a little bit more than you.
Yeah, that's what I would take from it.
When I'm writing drum parts, I talk to bass players, I talk to drummers, and say, does this make sense? Can you do this on your instrument? Because I don't play that instrument.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, why don't we talk about a band that didn't really have many flaws? How about that New Jersey All-State Jazz Ensemble that you just got done? Why don't you talk to us about your programming and your experience being a part of that, and what a cool chair to hold to be conductor of that band?
It was both an honor and a pleasure, and so much fun. It was exhausting, but I didn't realize how tired I was until after it was all over. Because while we were there in the moment, it didn't feel like, oh, we've got another 3-hour rehearsal in front of us. Because we did 3 hours on Tuesday night, 3 hours Wednesday morning, 3 hours Wednesday afternoon, 4 hours Wednesday night. Thursday morning, we did 2 hours, which was like, oh, we're done already?
Wow.
The hours flew by because we were having so much fun. And I don't mean to be just like, oh, it was so fun. It was like, we were all just there for the same reason. And I think, again, finding those kindred spirits, these are probably all the hottest players in their schools. So for them to come into a situation where they, the drummer and the bass player immediately connected, maybe they knew each other. I don't know, but it certainly sounded like it, because I could see them looking back at each other and kind of smiling and being like, yeah, we're in the zone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, and what was a gift was be able to have all that time and do the concert in Atlantic City, and then a week later to be able to reconnect and then do another concert and at the NJ Pack, and to another packed house, to a standing ovation. And it was allowing them to see that, like, this music, it's important what we do. I mean, we're not doctors, we're not doing things that people can die from. No one's going to die from a musical emergency, but what we're doing is important. And I want musicians to remember that, the impact that we have on people. I had someone tell me that when they go and have chemotherapy, they take my music in to listen with them. I mean, that's some heavy stuff, and when you touch people in the way that we do, the symbiotic relationship between the bass player and the drummer, between the lead players, between you and the instrument, between you and the director, between you and the audience, watching the audience get excited about it. And then you play a little better because you saw the audience get excited about it. And because you're playing better, the audience is getting even more excited. Just to see these genuine, like, goosebumpy moments that happen that elevate it beyond just like, okay, we're checking off another, like, activity for our college application, to realizing that we're doing something real and genuine, and having, a genuine connection with other people, which is, again, not to sound trite or be sing-songy about this, but, everything we're doing here has larger implications beyond, just trying to play well. I mean, we spend so much time by ourselves to realize that, this is actually something that connects you to other people.
Awesome. Well, before I run out of time, I want to ask really quick, where can people hear your music, find your music, whether published? I know you mentioned Kendor, but how about listening to the band or anything like that on the socials?
Yeah, please. All my stuff is streaming on all platforms. So, I mean, that's iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, Apple Music. I mean, all it's you just Google Andrew New, Neu. You will find me, and it's the Andrew New Big Band. So I have sort of another side career. I mean, I tour as a musician. I spent many years with a singer named Bobby Caldwell. I toured with Diane Shore, Smokey Robinson. And so I've done a lot in the world of smooth jazz and worked with some incredible musicians who play both, not only play exceptionally, but are really good jazz players. People like Brian Bromberg and Chuck Loeb and Rick Braun, Gerald Albright are all incredible bebop and straight ahead jazz players. So I have this other like career as a smooth jazz player. So if you Google me, you'll find both my big band music, and it's published, as I said, with Kendor. So you can find that with J.W. Pepper. Please send that information to your directors. I would love to hear my music played by your bands.
Awesome.
And just know that like we're all in this together. So if there's anyone that has, any questions about anything, chances are, most musicians on any level, whether you're talking about like a Chris Potter, Herbie Hancock might be a little harder to get to, but, we're all out there willing to answer those questions for you.
Andrew, this is awesome, man. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and great to learn a little bit more about you, and looking forward to sharing this with our members.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you so much, Earl.
All right, buddy. Good to see you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.